At 67, Vince Gill finally did something fans had been waiting for. He opened his heart about Kris Kristofferson. For decades, Gill had admired the man from afar, quietly influenced by his words, his boldness, and the way he broke open country music. But in a rare moment of reflection, Vince admitted a truth many suspected, but had never heard directly from him. Kris Kristofferson had changed his life, and perhaps even saved country songwriting itself. For those who don't know the depth of Kris Kristofferson's impact, it's easy to underestimate what Gill's confession meant. Kristofferson wasn't just another singer in Nashville. He was a disruptor. In the 1960s and 70s, when mainstream country often stuck to tidy love songs and polished arrangements, Kris arrived with lyrics that felt raw, wounded, and unfiltered. Songs like Me and Bobby McGee and Sunday Morning Comin' Down weren't designed to please the industry. They were crafted to tell the truth, however uncomfortable it might be. They spoke of longing, regret, loneliness, and survival, themes that didn't always align with radio's demands, but resonated deeply with real people. Vince Gill grew up hearing those songs, and like countless musicians of his generation, he absorbed their lessons. What struck him wasn't just the beauty of the melodies, but the bravery behind the words. In one of his interviews, Gill said simply, "He changed the face of how songs were written here." That short statement carried decades of weight. For Gill, Kristofferson was the artist who shifted Nashville from predictable formula to fearless honesty. Without Kris, country music might never have evolved into the introspective art form it later became. Gill admitted that what he admired most wasn't Kristofferson's voice because even he acknowledged it wasn't technically flawless. He admitted bluntly, the voice was not necessarily great. But that wasn't the point. The songs themselves were so strong, so undeniable, that the imperfections didn't matter. They might have even made the delivery more authentic. For Vince, this was a revelation. Greatness in music wasn't about polish, but about truth. And that's what Kristofferson embodied every time he sang. As Vince reached his 60s, he began reflecting more openly on his heroes, and Kris always came to the forefront. He recalled moments when Kristofferson's presence seemed larger than life. Imagine being a young songwriter, trying to find your way, and watching this Rhodes Scholar-turned-Army captain walk into Nashville with nothing but guts and guitar strings, rewriting the rules. Kristofferson had been a janitor at Columbia Records, sweeping floors while secretly slipping tapes to artists. He had slept on couches, worked odd jobs, and endured humiliation. Yet he refused to quit. That grit left a lasting impression on Gill. But Vince's truth wasn't only about Kristofferson's career. It was about what Kris represented to him, personally. Here was a man who taught an entire generation of musicians that vulnerability was not weakness, that it was okay, no, necessary, to write about being broken, to admit to being lost, to confess mistakes. For a performer like Vince, who built a career on sincerity and heartfelt ballads, that influence was profound. Gill has always been known for his emotional openness. Songs like Go Rest High on That Mountain prove that. And in many ways, that artistic DNA traces back to Kristofferson's example. Vince's truth was that he might not have become the songwriter he is without Kris showing him the way. He owed more than just admiration. He owed a piece of his own artistry. There's also something telling in the timing of Vince's reflections. At 67, he was old enough to look back with perspective. The bravado of youth had faded, and what remained was gratitude. Gratitude for mentors, gratitude for music, gratitude for the chance to share a stage and a moment with legends. And in that reflective stage of life, Kris Kristofferson stood tallest among the giants. This admission also carried emotional weight because Kristofferson himself, in his later years, struggled with memory loss and health issues. For Vince, honoring him wasn't just about music. It was about giving thanks before it was too late. In one interview, he mentioned how special it was to sit with Kris, to hold his hand during a Country Music Hall of Fame induction, and to simply be there with him. That wasn't the voice of a fan. That was the voice of a friend, a peer, and a man who knew the clock was ticking. When Vince Gill finally spoke his truth about Kris Kristofferson, it wasn't shocking. It wasn't scandalous. It wasn't the kind of truth designed to grab tabloid headlines. Instead, it was something far more powerful, an honest acknowledgement of debt, respect, and love. In a world obsessed with hype, that kind of truth is rare. For fans, hearing Vince openly say these words was a reminder of how interconnected artists really are. Every song we hear, every performance we love, is built on the shoulders of those who came before. Vince Gill's success cannot be separated from Kris Kristofferson's bravery. And by admitting that, Gill not only honored his hero, he gave fans a glimpse into the fragile, beautiful chain of inspiration that keeps music alive. And so, at age 67, Vince Gill gave us a confession worth remembering, that behind his success stood a man who had dared to tell the truth in song. And by doing so, Kris Kristofferson gave others permission to do the same. For all his admiration of Kris Kristofferson, Vince Gill knew there was one story he could never leave untold. It wasn't about Kristofferson's bravery or his wild stories or even his revolutionary songwriting. No, this was about a mistake. A mistake Vince made as a songwriter himself, one that left him both embarrassed and grateful, and that ultimately deepened his respect for Kristofferson. The year was 1997. Gill had been long established as one of Nashville's most respected artists. His voice was smooth, his guitar playing exceptional, and his songs had earned him multiple Grammy Awards. But like every songwriter, Gill sometimes found inspiration from places so deep in memory that he didn't recognize where it came from. And in one particular case, that memory belonged to Kris Kristofferson. Gill explained that while writing one of his own tracks, he unknowingly mirrored the melody of Kristofferson's classic, "Help Me Make It Through the Night." To any trained ear, or even to a devoted fan, the resemblance was unmistakable. When Gill realized what had happened, the feeling wasn't pride, it was panic. Here he was, an award-winning songwriter, and he had accidentally borrowed from one of the greatest songs ever written. Most artists would have tried to hide it, to quietly bury the similarity or hope nobody noticed. But Vince Gill isn't most artists. Instead, he did something many would find terrifying. He went straight to Kris Kristofferson to confess. Gill later recalled the conversation vividly. He approached Kris, admitted that he had essentially stolen the melody, and offered an apology. It was the kind of moment that could have gone badly in so many ways. Kristofferson could have been angry. He could have demanded credit. He could have accused Gill of plagiarism. For a songwriter, there are few sins more serious than lifting another's melody. But what happened next revealed everything about Kris Kristofferson's character. He looked at Vince, smiled, and with complete calm said, "I don't care." That was it. No lecture, no complaint, no bitterness. Just 3 simple words that carried the weight of a lifetime of wisdom. For Gill, that response was staggering. Here was a man who had written some of the most timeless songs in country music, songs that could easily have made him protective or defensive. Yet Kristofferson brushed it off without a second thought. Why? Because Kris understood something fundamental about art, that once you've created something truly great, nobody can take it from you. His legacy wasn't threatened by echoes or imitation. His songs were too strong, too permanent, too alive in the world to be diminished by anyone else. Gill admitted that this moment taught him more than any songwriting class or industry seminar ever could. It showed him that true greatness doesn't cling. True greatness doesn't police its boundaries. Instead, it exists so firmly in its own power that it can't be shaken by someone else stumbling into its territory. Think about that. A man of Kristofferson's stature telling Vince Gill, a man who already had Grammys, platinum records, and a career of his own, "I don't care." In those words, Kris gave Vince a gift. He gave him freedom. He gave him permission to make mistakes, to be human, to remember that even the best artists are still vulnerable to echoes of the voices that shaped them. Vince has often repeated that story not out of shame, but out of gratitude. To him, it was a priceless lesson in humility, both his own for admitting the mistake and Kristofferson's for forgiving it so easily. It was also a reminder that art is a living thing, flowing from one generation to the next. Sometimes, that flow is intentional. Sometimes it's unconscious. But either way, it's how music evolves. What makes the story even more powerful is the contrast between the two men. Vince Gill is known for his polished tenor, his pristine performances, his technical mastery. Kristofferson, on the other hand, was never celebrated for a flawless voice. His power came from his words, from the grit and truth embedded in every line. And yet, here was Gill, with all his technical brilliance, admitting to, unintentionally, copying a man who built his career on raw imperfection. It was almost poetic, an acknowledgement that even perfection bows to truth. The mistake also deepened the bond between the two. It wasn't the kind of connection forged through collaborations or joint tours, but something subtler. It was For Vince Gill, the mistake wasn't the legacy. The lesson was. And in that lesson, he found a deeper connection to the man who had already shaped so much of his career. If Vince Gill admired Kris Kristofferson for his humility and his songwriting genius, there was another side of Kris that fascinated him just as much, his grit. Because Kris wasn't just a poet with a guitar. He was a man who lived on the edge, a man who took risks that others wouldn't even dare to imagine. And perhaps the most legendary story that captured this side of Kristofferson's character involved a helicopter, a song, and Johnny Cash. 2. Understand why this story mattered so much, you have to first understand where Kris came from. He wasn't supposed to be a songwriter at all, not in the eyes of his family at least. Born into a strict military household, Kristofferson was groomed for a respectable career. He studied literature at Pomona College, earned a Rhodes Scholarship, and then became a helicopter pilot in the U.S. Army. His family expected him to follow in his father's footsteps, serving a disciplined life as a soldier or officer. But Kris had other ideas. He loved words, and he loved music even more. When he left the Army, he shocked his family by moving to Nashville to chase a dream that seemed, at the time, ridiculous. To them, it was a fall from grace. Here was a decorated pilot, a man with one of the most promising military careers ahead of him, throwing it all away to sweep floors at Columbia Studios just to be near the music he loved. That decision cost him dearly. His family disowned him, his marriage fell apart, and he was left living in near poverty. But none of it stopped him. Kristofferson wasn't chasing safety. He was chasing truth. And truth, he believed, lived in songs. Which brings us to that helicopter. In the late 1960s, Kris was still trying to make his way in Nashville. He had written songs that showed promise, but nobody seemed to be listening. Producers brushed him off. Record labels passed on him. Even established artists weren't paying attention. To Kris, the problem wasn't that the songs weren't good enough. The problem was that he couldn't get anyone important to hear them. That's when he came up with an idea, one that was so bold, so outrageous it would become legend. At the time, Johnny Cash was already a towering figure in country music. He was larger than life, a star whose voice carried the weight of America itself. If Kris could get his song into Cash's hands, he knew it could change everything. The question was how. Kris had an advantage, his time as a pilot. So one day, he climbed into a helicopter, flew it across Nashville, and landed it right on Johnny, Cash's front lawn. In his hand, he carried a tape with one song that he believed could change his life, Sunday Morning Comin' Down. Imagine the scene. Cash, relaxing at home, hears the roar of helicopter blades outside his house. He steps out, and there's Kris Kristofferson, standing with a tape in hand, refusing to be ignored. That single act of audacity became one of the most famous moments in country music history. And it worked. Cash listened to the song, and not only did he record it, he made it a hit. When Johnny Cash performed Sunday Morning Comin' Down on his television show, he faced pressure from network executives. They wanted him to change the lyric, "I'm wishing, Lord, that I was stoned." It was too controversial, they said, too risky for TV. But Cash refused. He sang it exactly as Kristofferson had written it. That decision not only validated Kris as a songwriter, it introduced him to the world as an artist who wrote with raw honesty, unafraid of life's darker truths. For Vince Gill, this story symbolized everything he admired about Kristofferson. It wasn't just about guts. It was about authenticity. Kris wasn't trying to be outrageous for attention. He wasn't chasing shock value. He simply believed in his song so much that he was willing to risk everything, his reputation, his dignity, even his safety, to get them heard. And when the moment came, Johnny Cash honored that belief by standing firm, refusing to censor a single word. Gill often spoke about how that helicopter story wasn't just a piece of folklore, it was a lesson. It showed him that sometimes the difference between being forgotten and being remembered is the willingness to take risks. If Kris had played it safe, if he had mailed the tape or handed it to a secretary, it might have been lost forever. Instead, he put himself directly in the path of destiny. And beyond the spectacle of the helicopter, the heart of the story was the song itself. Sunday Morning Comin' Down wasn't a cheerful, radio-friendly tune. It was bleak. It was about loneliness, regret, and the kind of quiet despair most people don't want to face. Yet somehow, it resonated with millions. That was Kristofferson's genius. He gave voice to emotions people usually hide, and he did it with unflinching honesty. For Vince Gill, hearing that story made him realize something profound. Country music wasn't about polish. It wasn't about pleasing executives or smoothing out the rough edges. It was about truth. And sometimes, truth takes a helicopter to deliver. For Vince Gill, Kris Kristofferson was never just a songwriter. He was a mentor from afar, a pioneer, who reshaped what country music could be. But as the years passed, their relationship became something deeper, more personal, more tender. It was no longer just about music. It was about friendship, respect, and ultimately, love. And one of the most unforgettable memories Vince carries is from a day that wasn't about guitars or hit records at all. It was about holding hands. Bye. Scene was the Country Music Hall of Fame. The air was thick with reverence that day. Legends, fans, and families filled the room to celebrate the men and women whose songs had built the foundation of the genre. For Vince Gill, these ceremonies were always emotional, but this time there was something different. Kris Kristofferson was there too, though he was no longer the larger-than-life figure who had once landed helicopters in Johnny Cash's yard. Time had left its mark. By then, Kristofferson was struggling with memory loss. For years, doctors had misdiagnosed him with Alzheimer's and dementia. Later, it was discovered he was actually suffering from Lyme disease, which can mimic those conditions. But the damage had already been done. Kris, the man whose words had once painted such vivid portraits of the human condition, now faced a cruel irony. His own memories were slipping away. For Vince Gill, watching this decline was heartbreaking. He had grown up idolizing Kristofferson, studying his songs like scripture, and now, here was his hero, frail, vulnerable, and needing help. Yet rather than focus on the sadness, Vince chose something simpler, something more human. That day, as they sat together in the audience, Vince reached over and quietly held Kris's hand. It was a small gesture, but to Vince it carried the weight of decades. That hand he held had written Me and Bobby McGee. It had written, "Help me make it through the night." It had penned words that gave voice to millions who couldn't find their own. And now, in silence, Gill gave something back. Not applause, not analysis, not industry praise, but comfort. For those who saw it, the moment was unforgettable. There were no cameras zooming in for drama. There were no interviews to frame it. It was just two men, side by side, sharing something that transcended music. It was about connection. The kind of connection that remains even when memory fades, even when words slip away. Gill would later talk about that day, his voice breaking with emotion. He admitted that it was one of the hardest things he had ever experienced. To see his hero in that state, and yet to realize that the bond between them didn't need perfect memory or perfect health to exist, it only needed presence. This moment revealed something essential about Vince Gill himself. For all his success, for the awards, the acclaim, the respect he earned in Nashville, he has always been guided by kindness. The same man who once sang harmonies to comfort grieving families at funerals was the man who sat quietly, hand in hand, with Kris Kristofferson at the Hall of Fame. It wasn't for show. It wasn't for legacy. It was for love. And perhaps that's the real truth Vince Gill admitted about Kris Kristofferson. It wasn't just about his songwriting brilliance or his daring career moves. It was about the way he carried himself. The humility he showed when Vince confessed stealing a melody, the bravery he showed when he risked everything for his songs, the authenticity he showed by never backing down from the truth. Those qualities left a mark not just on music, but on the people around him. For Vince, holding Kris's hand was a way of saying, "Thank you. Thank you for the songs. Thank you for the lessons. Thank you for being brave enough to live life on your own terms." It was also a way of saying goodbye, not in the final sense, but goodbye to the Kris who had once commanded a room with his energy, goodbye to the fearless young songwriter who had conquered Nashville his own way. What remained was something softer, but no less important. The bond between two men who had walked different paths, but met at the same truth. That music at its best is about honesty, and honesty is love. The image of Vince Gill and Kris Kristofferson at the Hall of Fame stands as one of the most powerful symbols in country music history. Not because it was loud or dramatic, but because it was quiet. In an industry obsessed with spectacle, it was a reminder that the most meaningful moments often happen in silence, and as fans, we're left with that picture. A younger man who once idolized an older one, now comforting him in his frailty. A passing of the torch, not in words or in ceremony, but in a touch. For Vince Gill, that was the truth he wanted the world